Thank you for joining us today to discuss how Abiomed reduced the time, expense, and effort associated with Sarbanes-Oxley reporting. Today you will hear about how Abiomed reduced costs, streamlined their processes, and overcame their challenges with SOX reporting, utilizing Symmetry's compliance automation solution, ControlPanelGRC. Next slide, please. Our presenters today, one of our presenters, he'll be the second one speaking today, is Scott Goolik, and he is the Chief Technology Officer of SimSoft Corporation, with responsibility for architecting the ControlPanelGRC solution. Scott is a recognized expert in the field of SAP security and controls with over 12 years experience. His experience includes working for one of the big 4 accounting firms and developing auditing tools, including those for segregation of duties. For those of you on the line who are new to Symmetry, we are an SAP hosting partner and leading provider of services and support for all of your SAP basis, security, and project consulting needs. SimSoft Corporation is a sister company to Symmetry. Many of the products that make up the ControlPanelGRC suite were originally developed and used in-house here at Symmetry to help our own basis and security team. Our first presenter today is Sharon Kaiser of Abiomed. Abiomed is a client of Symmetry who utilizes ControlPanelGRC as well as our basis and security managed services. Sharon has been in the IT business for close to 30 years, working in the petroleum, credit card, footwear and apparel, and medical device industries. Each industry has its own unique twists for governance, risks, and controls, ranging from the Clear Air Act to SOX. Sharon is currently the CIO for Abiomed, a medical device company based out of Danvers, Massachusetts, that focuses on heart recovery. So without further ado, Sharon, I'd like to hand it over to you, so take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Heather. Welcome, everybody. What we're going to go over today is a little bit about the journey that Abiomed went through with our compliance, and then Scott's going to talk a little bit about some of the controls themselves, and I'll come back and talk to you about how we helped ourselves through an automated solution. So first, as Heather was mentioning, we are a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. That means that we have to be compliant to Sarbanes-Oxley. We are in the medical device area, and we manufacture artificial hearts and heart pumps with the goal to recover hearts and save lives. Our main headquarters and a manufacturing facility is in Danvers, Mass., and we also have an additional manufacturing facility in Aachen, Germany. Between the 2 sites and also some in the field, we have about 350 employees, and our expertise over the last almost 30 years has been in pumping blood. And it's hard to imagine, but our newest product, the Impella, the pump on that product is no bigger than the fingernail on my little finger. It's that small. So it's pretty awesome. As you can imagine, we spend a lot of money on research and development, and over the time we've been able to help quite a few patients in over 40 countries. So we are global. Now, yesterday I would have told you that we have to be very cost efficient because we haven't made money yet. But today we just announced that for the first quarter in almost 30 years we are now non-GAAP profitable. We are generating cash flow. So it's a very big day for us. But that doesn't mean we still can't be cost efficient and effective in what we do. Just for to let you understand what our SAP landscape is, we implemented SAP in 2006. We have one instance that's located here in Danvers on ECC 5.0. The users that we have, like I said, are US and Europe, mainly in Germany, and also a few in Canada. And one of the things that I was very surprised about when I came to Abiomed was, for such a small company as we were, we implemented a lot of SAP. You know, we've got the finance and controlling, material management, PP, sales and distribution, quality, document management system, service module, and a little bit of the HR too, more of the organization and the HR master stuff. So it's a lot, and it has helped us quite a bit. And one of the things that we recently did was look at our whole SOX compliance and what we wanted to get for it. But first, I'd like to go back to sort of the beginning. After the Act was put into place, Abiomed decided to hire an outside auditing company to come in and just sort of take a look at where we were. We don't have then or now an internal audit department, so we hired another firm to come in and take a look for us. And based on their experience and what they had done at other companies, they came up with a list of 139 items that they thought would be appropriate, some risks that a company of our size and what we did should be careful of. So they did a gap analysis and put a report out. And of course, as any good consulting firm will do, the next step was to put in another project plan for a detailed assessment, which was the next step. So they did come in and do a more detailed and thorough risk assessment in both the business, financial, IT areas, and identified some key controls in each of those areas that we should be looking at. And then, of course, they came up with a control matrix, identified those key controls, what they really meant, what we needed to control out of it, and then also a test plan and how those controls were going to be tested. So from that initial assessment, they came out with 69 initial IT general controls and then an additional 26 IT application controls. So quite a few when you take a look at it. And Abiomed management decided, we're too small to have our own internal audit department, so we did hire a company to act as what I call our internal auditing department and do a pre-audit before the auditors come in. This would allow Abiomed itself the resources to focus on their day-to-day activities and what they should be working on. And also, people that are in the business, they can keep up with best practices. And so we always have, every year, somebody coming in, and as we review the controls that we've already defined, we talk about any changes or trends in the industry, what we need to focus on, maybe do we still have the right controls for our business. And of course, you only pay for the hours that they're on site. So it was a good deal for both the company and Abiomed. Now, the approach they took, basically this firm was going to help, and this is still what they pretty much do in general today. They come in before our external auditors, they sit down with us, and we take a look at what we want, our control matrix, what we're actually going to be looking at and testing. And they actually bring the resources in to perform the actual testing itself. Then they produce reports and go over it with management, and we look to see if we have any deficiencies that we need to close before the real auditors come in. And going to the next slide as soon as the system comes back. I'm sorry, we're having technical difficulties getting, there we go. Sorry about that. So that first pre-audit that was done some time ago had 9 deficiencies that were identified, and they pretty much fell in similar categories. One of the first ones that I was a little surprised about is they identified excessive access by IT. Basically, IT developers had access to change data in the production systems, which is always a no-no for everybody. A lot of times also they found that when somebody changed a role in the company, there wasn't a really good process to take a look and remove the existing controls that they had had. They always get the new roles for the new job, but the old ones were still there. And basically just, in general, we needed to document better, follow the procedures better. So although the testing revealed really everything was okay as far as there were no inappropriate actions, there were gaps in how we were not managing to the processes we had, and also that we wanted to improve the documentation and any new procedures that we needed. And there we go. Now, as far as that first audit that was done, one of the things that I want to talk to you about is before you define or take a look at a caution is be very careful of what you define as a control, because that's what you're going to be audited on. And many of the things that I found are those 69 initial controls were things that really a good IT department or a good finance department should do anyway as best practice. So when you're looking at what controls you want to manage, make sure they're the ones that you want to be audited. And we learned that we needed to organize better, have our processes defined better, and then manage to those processes. And then also, the people that came in after these initial audits were done, we needed to provide training for them so they could understand what they did in their day-to-day role, how that impacted maybe our SOX compliance needs. And I'm still having problems going to the next slide. I apologize. So where we were in late 2009, we had a couple areas that we were looking at. The controller and I sat down and we were talking about risk management, what we wanted to do. And we knew that there was a lot of roles that we had done for SAP that were taken from generic SAP defined roles, and they weren't really specialized to fit Abiomed's needs. Also, when you talk about all those 69 general IT controls, they are very detail oriented. And what we wanted to look at more was the AS5 risk-based controls that really look at a top-down view instead of the bottoms-up. And then we talked about, there's a lot of manual repetitive tasks that both finance people and IT people did for our SOX compliance. And we looked at or talked about maybe we could afford an automated solution to help us in some areas. And three of the goals that we thought we would look at were how could we reduce our costs and provide efficiencies? How could we manage and mitigate to our risks? And how could we ensure that Abiomed was compliant and had the reporting that we need? But we had some challenges when we started looking at automation. We did still have a lot of areas that had excessive controls, and we wanted to look at the segregation of duty issues. But being, again, a small company, sometimes people actually had a need to wear multiple hats and would have multiple roles that might kick out as a high risk on our reports. A lot of our IT general controls are managed manually, and they are tested manually. If you're very familiar with SAP at all, you know that sometimes the data is there, but it's very hard sometimes to pull that information out. And we have a very limited staff, but they had to be on top of, in their day-to-day, what the controls were that we were managing to and how their jobs influenced that. So now I want to go over a little bit on an example of an excessive control project that we did at Abiomed. This was about 1.5 years ago. And in SAP, there's a transaction called a MIGO transaction that is used to move materials from one place to another, a storage location or whatever. And there's different material movement codes. And at the time, there was really not any one person at Abiomed that was accountable for the inventory itself. And a lot of people that actually executed the MIGO transaction, they only knew their particular job, very narrow focus, and they didn't understand what happened before they got involved or what happened afterwards. And sometimes they would just put material movement codes in, not knowing or understanding what would happen in the back end. So the result of that was that every month finance was repeatedly going in and correcting journal entries so that the inventory was accurate. So what this project did was take a look at really how people used and should use the material movement code. And we wanted to define how each specific role would use those codes. So for example, what transactions and what material movement codes does a quality inspector need to do his job? So in the end, we ended up taking that one all-encompassing role that really impacted our inventory accuracy, and it became 17 distinct roles that we could use both in Danvers and in Aachen that was very specific to the role that a person and the job that they performed. And of course, as with any initiative in SAT, we did extensive testing. We verified that the new security, the new roles worked. And it was very manually intensive. It took over 3 months really to get from start to finish and get everything in place. But that project had a lot of good benefits to it. the main one was that the controls were improved so significantly that Abiomed is now exempt from our monthly periodic physical inventory counts, and which of course takes time and money, so we reduce the cost. And it's just really helped our finance team be more, the inventory that they have, they don't spend as much time reconciling back and forth to the physical counts to what's on the book. So it's really been a good project for us. So that was one thing we looked at that was very a manually intensive project. And so we looked at all those things that we were trying to do and looked at, did we really have the need to find an automated solution? So we looked at a lot of different things, and this is a list of some of the things that we looked at to automate, and we decided that yes, we did. Going back to those first 3 goals that we had talked about at the very beginning, we said, okay, if our first goal was really to reduce our costs and provide efficiencies, what does that mean? What are we trying to accomplish? So we came up with a list of the objectives. Sort of talks to itself. We wanted to automate as much as we could, streamline our processes, improve the efficiencies. But of course you have challenges with everything you're trying to do. Sometimes where the data is today, we had to go dig data out, reconstruct it, and then be able to provide it to our auditors. It's very labor intensive, and then I'll get a little bit more into it, but our quarterly access reviews was very labor intensive, and we wanted a solution that would help us automate some of that process. In managing our risks and mitigating those risks, we wanted to look at how to simplify our user access, how we could consolidate different procedures and data, and basically, in effect, provide more efficient and timely review of our SAP emergency access process. And if you're familiar with SAP, it's the fire call access role. And the challenges we had with that is really in talking with our functional owners. They would receive these quarterly reports that identified people in their departments that had certain roles, and they needed to understand what those roles provided and should they have access to those roles. So a challenge to us was making sure people understood what they were reviewing so they just didn't rubber stamp an approval. We also, part of our compliance with our Sarbanes-Oxley rules is that we wanted at least 3 business reviewers to take a look at every change that went into the production SAP environment. We wanted them to review and approve that it was okay to move into production. We wanted to see if we could automate that. And that fire call access that we had, part of the problem was the IT management team would get together once a month and basically review all the prior month's fire call activity. We'd look at the transactions, look at the documentation, and make sure it was okay. But at some point, it could be 30 days after the fact and might be too late to really question or prevent abuse of the system. And the third area that we were looking at, we basically wanted to make sure Abiomed was compliant in all its reporting requirements, that the financial statements were accurate and produced in a timely manner. We wanted to, again, automate as much as we could. And instead of having a lot of data to look through, we wanted to move to more of an exception-based reporting format and provide data online through querying capabilities. Basically add more information with higher value. And the same thing, the data is in SAP, but sometimes it's hard to get out, hard to get queries for the data that you wanted. So when we were looking for a solution, we sort of high-level defined some requirements that we were looking for. We wanted help in our analysis for the segregation of duties and sensitive authorizations. We wanted help in tracking and reporting of the actual system usage, so actually what people performed and how they did their jobs. We had the transport process within SAP, so we wanted to automate that as much as possible through the system using workflow and with audit data so that we could have a trail for the auditors. We also, in our security process, if someone needed a new role, we wanted to be able to automate that where that new role request could flow to the functional owner of that role. They could look at it and approve it, and we could move on. So we wanted speed on that area. The fire call access, we needed a better way to go in and take a look at that just to make sure it was authorized and everything was okay. We wanted to make sure we had automated reports, more exception-based reports. And we also, there's a couple key jobs that we have that run nightly that produce our financial invoices. And those are the ones that are monitored within our SOX controls. So we wanted a way to be able to better monitor the success or failure of those jobs that ran every night, and be able to go into the system and also have the data in the system so when the auditors check that particular control, the information is there for them. So now I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and he's going to go over the next two agenda items for you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. So as Sharon said, we're going to be talking about some of the controls that were set up in Abiomed's environment. To give you a little background on myself and my team, we were brought in to help manage Abiomed's security and controls after go live back in 2006. So all these different controls and discussions that Sharon has referred to and talked about how the internal auditors have kind of dictated that, my team was actually responsible for implementing and providing some automation for those controls. So we're going to start by talking about some of the key preventive and detective access controls that we utilize on a periodic basis. And then we're going to jump into talking about how we leverage controls over emergency access and SAP transports. So like Sharon was saying, the internal audit group is really someone that's had a big depth or a deep depth into their environment. The internal auditors wanted stakeholders to be involved in the various change management processes, including approving security assignments. So we needed to have role owner approvals for all of our security changes. Well, we kind of looked around and said, well, who are the role owners? Who are these people in our business? We also needed to make sure that we had compliance checks being executed for all the user and role changes. And it wasn't good enough just to look at a role, but hey, if we're making a change to a role and we're adding transactions, what is that going to do to the various users assigned to those roles in the production system? Are we increasing any user risk as part of it? And of course, the auditors wanted to make sure we had some sort of a process that could be audited at any time. And from Sharon's team's perspective, they didn't have the availability to have resources preparing these reports for the audit folks. So the first step that we had here was we needed to define our role owners. So the role owners in our environment are folks that are responsible for approving assignment and definition changes to roles. We kind of used a two-prong approach with this, using global role owners and local role owners. Our global role owners are responsible for approving sort of the contents of the role, what transactions. Our local role owners are the folks at individual locations, as Sharon had mentioned, in Danvers and in Aachen, and it's the assignment of those roles to the users. The reason we use that local role owner concept is the managers at those given locations better know their employees and therefore have a better idea of what roles someone should have access to. We chose to define our role owners as department heads. We saw it as the folks that were ultimately responsible for the data in the system. So you'd had people like a vice president of manufacturing, vice president of HR, finance, and so forth. So now that we had our role owners, we needed to define the actual security change process. We had a handful of request initiation scenarios. So for example, the help desk receives a call and needs to create a request to give someone access in the system. But there are also times where IT support would be creating a new transaction or report and recognize that they needed to provide access to that for existing employees. And then lastly, an employee might be hired, and we needed to have an automatic provisioning process in place to be able to assign default roles to that person based on the fact that they're an employee in our organization. As part of this process, we needed to involve our role owners. So the request had to be approved, and as part of that, we wanted to make sure segregation of duty checks occurred. So if we're creating a new user in the finance department and we're giving them access that is going to create risk, we needed to make sure that role owner was aware of the risk, and then they could make that final decision on whether or not the segregation of duty was reasonable or if there were appropriate mitigating controls in place that could be utilized. So now that we had our process defined, now I'm having the issues moving to the next slide. There we go. We needed to get that request forwarded to the security team, which is my team, for review and processing. One of the challenges with a global operation is that users need to be changed and maintained in both the U.S. and European locations. So we needed a solution that provided us with automatic provisioning of user changes to not make the folks in the Aachen location wait. Of course, there's manual implementation of role changes, but we do have some integration into transport management that we'll talk about a little bit later. Once that process is completed, then the communication goes back to the requester to let them know that their change is ready and active in the production system. As well as a provisioning process, we needed to have a deprovisioning process. So we have all of our employee logons tied to employee master records in the HCM module, and we have a nightly process that's going to run and identify instances where someone may have been terminated and compares that to any current logons. We then have automatic deprovisioning for terminated employees. So what this means is that if somebody leaves the company, we can automatically terminate them and get all their credentials taken out of the SAP system. We'll talk a little bit about how we address non-employee logons when we get into the detective access controls in the next section. But the important part of this process is we're using a documented workflow through Control Panel, and that puts us in a continuous state of audit readiness. Whenever the auditors want to come in, we can pull that reporting very easily. Ultimately, the auditors will come up with a list of user or role changes that were processed over the period, and we can very easily pull all the supporting documentation from the workflow, which would contain any testing details for role changes, approvals for assignments, and so forth. So we're always ready for them. On the detective side, we have some controls in place for security monitoring. And when the auditors were going through that implementation process, they came up with a bit of a laundry list of different checks that they wanted to make sure were run on a monthly basis. Segregation of duties, sensitive authorizations, review of powerful roles and profiles, inactive users, non-employee logons, and making sure that user access is current and reasonable. Well, this creates a challenge for a small organization such as Abiomed, because that's a lot of reporting that has to be run. So what we did was we worked with the internal auditors to define the risks. So in the case of putting together segregation of duties and all these different things, the auditors had feedback and provided input to my team to help define automated controls that could be put in place, and then use the auto auditor function in the control panel workflow to push all this reporting out to the appropriate owners on a monthly basis. So as the auditors define a risk, our team defines an automated control, pushes that out in the workflow. The risk owner or the appropriate reviewer is going to review that output, and then we have our audit review at any time. We're in a constant state of audit readiness. The idea with this was that we wanted to bolster readiness for the approver. We wanted to make sure that they were aware of potential risks. Most of the reports are routed to IT management for documented review and workflow, and occasionally they will need to follow up with managers from other departments. But the nice thing is with the workflow, you can document any exceptions inside of there, and then when the auditors want to come in, they can review what was done with these controls, when the controls were last executed, and what exceptions were processed. So the first one of the controls was segregation of duties. So the auditors helped us define what things we cared about most as a business. When they looked at segregation of duties risks, they put emphasis on the procurement and finance processes, as they saw that being the biggest risk to Abiomed's business. We use the Control Panel Risk Analyzer to execute SOD reporting on the first of each month, and we provide a delta analysis, which allows us to detail changes between the previous periods. So we're saving time for Sharon's team by spelling out the true changes in risk between the periods and being able to monitor the exceptions. From a sensitive authorization perspective, the internal auditors had a specific list of things that they wanted to make sure wasn't assigned to either IT support folks or end users in the production system. And this was all the basic things. It's the ability to maintain workbench objects, maintain configuration, maintain number ranges. They had a laundry list of about 10 of them that they wanted us to be watching out for. So again, we were able to define this and run a sensitive authorization analysis in Risk Analyzer and push that output to IT management to review this and note any exceptions. The important thing is, of course, IT management doesn't necessarily have a master's in SAP security, so we had to make it so that it was easy to understand what the potential risks were so that it could be communicated back to my team as necessary to resolve. Sensitive roles and profiles is another thing that the auditors had, very strong feelings on. They wanted to make sure we didn't have users in the production system with SAP All or SAP New, or other powerful roles, such as we have roles that would give someone the ability to do configuration or maintain workbench objects. Those were roles that should only be assigned in our development system, and if they're assigned into the production system, that better be something that was approved by Sharon. So we're able to monitor this and, again, route the reports to IT management and workflow for a documented review. As I commented on before, we do have specific procedures for non-employees. So we've got automatic deprovisioning for employee users, but you've got consultants in the system that need to be monitored separately. In addition, we wanted to have our arms around the number of employees that haven't been in the system in over, say, 30 or 60 days. I believe 30 was what we had chose for Abiomed. And that was because we wanted to make sure that these folks truly were using the system, and if necessary, we could be adjusting their access or their licensing if they're not truly using the system. So on that monthly basis, we can push this report out to the IT management team at each location to make sure that the non-employee logons are truly active. So if we had a consultant in for a project, this is our check to make sure that they got deactivated or were automatically deactivated after that project ended. And lastly, review of delivered logons and security profile parameters. So this is the standard reports that you might see in RS-USR 003. The auditors wanted to make sure that this was being monitored on a periodic basis so we could verify that, say, SAP star wasn't available for logon with a password of pass, or looking at the profile parameters and making sure that they're in line with what was discussed with the auditors and haven't changed. So as an example, the password expiration time, making sure that that value is still reasonable, set as appropriate with our security policies. Any exceptions are then noted and submitted to my team for processing. So it's basically a similar process here where the auditors helped us identify what the control was. We generated an automated control, pushed the output of the report to the appropriate approver in workflow, and then any changes were communicated as part of that workflow, which puts us in a constant state of audit readiness. Whenever the auditors want to come in and review what we had done, they can. We also have the need to do a periodic user and role certification process. So our internal auditors determine that users and roles can change over time, and we need to make sure that they still are mapping to what the business needs. As Sharon commented, it's very uncommon for security access to be taken away. We get lots of requests to add access. We needed to have a role owner sign off that would actually look at things like current roles and assignments, changes to roles or users during the reporting period, so that's making sure that any changes that were processed were truly approved, and also the differences in segregation of duties between the previous periods. This process needed to be easy to audit, and we needed to be able to make sure that the appropriate approvers were signing off on a timely basis as part of our quarterly reporting. Now, without having IT staff available to start generating reports and pulling this together, this became a challenge. This is a lot of information that you have to pull together. You're talking about downloading user and role assignments, transaction execution logs, change documents, a segregation of duties analysis. All this stuff then has to be put into pivot tables or something outside of the system to make it easier for our role owners to understand what changes occurred or what they're actually approving. We went with an automated process, which is the Control Panel Access Certification Manager, to help generate these reports automatically for us in a usable format, and then use that same workflow to push the reports to role owners. We can then collect feedback from those role owners as to any changes that might be required. When the role owners receive their reports via the workflow, they can review the data in it. There's a variety of different slices of the data, and they can sign off, which will certify the analysis that they're aware of what people have access to in the system, and that it's reasonable given the scope of their jobs. If there are changes, and that could be things like user terminations, removing roles from users, removing transactions from roles, that gets captured automatically in the workflow, and my team then gets involved to process any changes that might be required. But again, we're in this constant state of audit readiness, as the auditors can come in then, look at what we've got in the system, look at the various approvals that have taken place, and feel confident that the business is involved in the security model. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the detective and preventive controls. Now we're going to talk a little bit about emergency access and SAP transports. One of the concerns that we heard from the internal auditors early on was, okay, we're going to give you a month to go live, but after that month, we want to make sure that your IT support personnel only have display access in the production system. This creates a challenge because IT support does need to have additional capabilities to troubleshoot problems. For example, pricing conditions aren't working right. I need to get into change mode on a sales order to look at that. The internal auditors also preferred that we did not use generic logons to actually answer this concern. And the problem with generic logons was, well, if I have that, I've got to rely on another system to understand who made a change when a generic logon was checked out. And it was also difficult to see when someone might have executed conflicting functions as part of a segregation of duty. Lastly, our internal auditors wanted an IT management sign-off after that emergency access session to ensure that we had a review for reasonableness as to what was done. So from a definition perspective, we wanted to grant emergency access to non-HR change functionality in our production system on a pre-approved basis. What that means is if our IT support folks run into an issue at 2 a.m., we don't want to have to involve the security team or get other people on the phone to grant that access. We've pre-approved it. In our quality systems, we grant a little more access, something we call SAP Almost, not quite SAP All. And we chose an automated solution, which is the Control Panel Emergency Access Manager, to do this provisioning for us and monitor what's going on. After the session is done, we can then use workflow to take the details from the emergency sessions and get that pushed to Sharon's team for review. From an execution perspective, an IT support user identifies a need. They've got to go in and change some data. So they're able to activate emergency access on their own and then process whatever those transactions are at that time. Once their session is complete, the monitoring jobs are going to identify any executed transactions and grab the change document statistical records and push that to Sharon's team in documented workflow. The IT management then gets the workflow request, can review what was done during the emergency session, and check for the reasonableness of any changes that were made. And of course, the auditors then can come back and take a sample of those emergency sessions and see the various sign-offs inside of workflow as to what sort of review was done by the IT management team. From the transport perspective, as you know, there's a lot of change that goes on in SAP environments. This becomes a little bit more complex when you're in a validated environment like Abiomed. They've got certain requirements where they need to make sure that we have all the testing information, approval details, and so forth. Our internal auditors also wanted us to make sure that the business owners had a sign-off in the change management process. So we needed to make sure that our business owners were aware of any changes that we were introducing and were able to be part of that testing process. And finally, our internal auditors wanted IT management to have sort of a final sign-off so that they could make sure that the appropriate documentation was in place, and they could also have prioritization of all the SAP changes as well as visibility of anything that's going on. Our first step here was that we created a change review board, or CRB, which represented the top management from all the major departments. In the Abiomed organization, that's about 10 people. Our CRB members are notified whenever changes are pending promotion to the production system, but we require just 3 sign-offs so that everybody else is CC'd on it, and we use a subset of that group to provide our approval. We use the Control Panel Transport Manager to implement a workflow-based process that manages all this documentation and approvals. Once we go through all those approvals by the CRB, and it gets approved by Sharon's team, the changes can migrate automatically into the production system without having to wait on involvement from the basis team. From the actual execution process, a change request is identified and it's allocated to a developer. The Abiomed developer is going to process the change. This might be adjusting a report, changing some configuration, and they're going to release that change into a transport and automatically into the control panel workflow. The workflow automation will then take that, that transport and import it into the quality system and notify the developer that it's available for testing. At that point, the developer is going to validate the changes and potentially involve the business in the change as well. The developer will record the final documentation and push it to the CRB so that they can validate the change, that they're aware of the change, that their people have tested the change, and then forward that to IT management for that final validation. Once approved by IT management, we're able to have the workflow automation again wake up and take our changes directly into the production system without having to wait on our basis team. And then the developer is able to do a final sign-off to indicate that the change is functioning properly in the production system. And again, the same theme, this puts us in a constant state of audit readiness. The auditors will definitely come back at the end of the year and say, we have a list of the import history from our production system, and we want to see documentation for these 20 changes or these 15 changes. And that's very easy to go into the workflow and pull out all the sign-offs, all the testing that was done, everything that is needed to satisfy those audit concerns. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the controls we've implemented at Abiomed. At this point, I'm going to turn it back to Sharon to chat a little bit about how Abiomed helped themselves with this automation.
All right, great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott, for going through the details of that. What I'd like to do now is go back through remembering those 3 goals that the controller and I set very first time we sat down and talked about what we needed in an automated solution. And so now, did ControlPanelGRC actually help us meet those goals? So the first goal in looking at cost reduction and efficiencies, I would say yes, it did. We now have the automated process that we can move a transport through the development system to quality into production after those 3 functional owners review and approve the transport. We have workflow that helps us route security requests now. All this information is there for our auditors. It has really helped accelerate our day-to-day processes within SAP for security and administration. Now, looking at specifically how it helped us, if you want to look at a return on investment here, those pre-audits that we used to have the people come in, they would spend weeks here. And since we put this system in, we've been able to reduce the time they spent on site by 50%, which results in that time and material. So it's been a great reduction for us on that. And it's been a big reduction in the time spent on compiling and distributing and following up with those quarterly segregation of duty reports. It used to take an IT team member about a week because it's a paper document packet, basically, with a front sheet and tons of, then he would distribute it out to each of the 10 functional owners, then he'd have to keep following up with them if they reviewed it. And at times, sometimes it took months. These were low priority, they'd sit on somebody's desk, they'd lose the paper, we'd have to recreate it. Now the process is done in a couple of hours. I can go into the system myself and see who's still pending approval on those, and I can send a quick email and says, we need to sort of do this for the auditors coming in. Let's get this review and approval done. So it's really helped in that area. The second goal that we had for managing our risks and mitigating those risks, did this solution meet that goal? And again, yes, it did. We now have the data there that we can pull out real time. We're in that, what we said, all the data is there for the readiness for our audits. We have a rule book now that it's already been predefined for us based on risks that many companies have, but we can also put individual Abiomed risks there that we can take a look at. We have the automatic monitoring of transaction execution, so I can actually see if someone executed a certain transaction that might have triggered a risk. We have the workflows there for the security requests. And then the fire call notification has improved dramatically. So if you look at specifically in that area, you know, I mentioned before that the IT management team would sit down on a monthly basis and review all the prior month's activities. Well, now I get notified when someone starts a fire call activity. I see when they end, and I can go right then and there because I'm notified. I can look to see what transactions were performed. I can see what documentation the developer put in the system of why he needed to do that, what problem he was trying to solve. And at that moment in time, I can say, I reviewed this, I approve it, don't see any problems, I sign it and save it, and it's in the system forever. I don't have to, you know, and if I have any problems with it, I can call him up right then and there. So it's a great thing. And now I want to go real quickly over an initiative that we've got going right now that the Control Panel GRC is helping us with. It's a joint initiative between finance and IT. We started it last fall, and basically we wanted to take a look at the authorizations that people have and how we could optimize those and really make them more efficient in our Abiomed environment. So we were going to identify in this initiative 3 key things. We wanted to look at the risks themselves and how we managed those risks. We wanted to look at the role assignments to individuals and how we might be able to optimize that. And then for things that we couldn't automatically monitor through the system, do we have the mitigating controls in place to be sure to manage all of our risks? So that first phase of the project, the risk identification, consists of a lot of activities that basically were analyzing a lot of details of what we needed to do, what were the business rules that we had, the custom transactions that we have in our system, and unfortunately we have more than we like. Are they included as well in this rule book so we can look to make sure we're managing our risks? And then we wanted to make sure we had an ongoing process to maintain that rule book, as well as a training program for people, for functional owners to know what they're looking at going forward. And a lot of the work ended up being in this next phase when they were doing the analysis of the existing role assignments. And they weren't just looking at what roles were assigned to people, they were actually looking at what transactions people actually performed, and maybe some of those roles that the people had excess transactions that they didn't need. So it was a very detailed analysis that they were going through. And then at the very end, they looked at, of all the activities that we had, what we're managing with the rule book, and looking at our segregation of duty analysis, what's left? What are some of the high-risk areas that we need to make sure we have different mitigating controls to manage? So at the end of this, and it's still going on, but they're getting close to the end, they identified or analyzed 368 potential risks. They identified 61 user role assignments that needed to be changed or modified in some way, and then 36 role changes, which means that maybe there were some transactions and some roles that nobody used or were excessive for that particular thing. And in the end, they also identified about 7 mitigating controls. So this whole process, once it's done, is really going to help Abiomed in our management of our segregation of duties. Now, going back to the third and the last goal that we had identified and making sure that Abiomed was compliant and that we had the proper reports, I would say yes again. Control Panel GRC helped us there. We met this goal. I now have all the exception reports that I can handle. Every month, actually the beginning of every month, I get a lot of reports that are very easy actually to go through. For example, like Scott mentioned, users with SAP all. I quickly open up the report. I look to make sure it's only the symmetry or the batch processes that have it, and I'm good. There's also a report that I get that shows the people that haven't logged onto the system in 30 days. Most of them are people in the field that only get into the system to enter a T&E report, and that's okay. Sometimes, though, there might be somebody that was actually terminated, and for some reason the process of termination didn't go through all the way, and we need to make some kind of change in the system. So at the end, what did we learn with this whole process that we went through and all the setting up a Control Panel GRC? Well, we did learn that there is some reasonably priced solutions out there on the market. When you're looking at them, though, I would say to first identify what you're really trying to capture. What are your objectives that you need? and make sure that you find a solution that fits your needs and don't overbuy, because that gets overly complicated. Because we selected what we needed to run Abiomed's business, the deployment was very quick and painless. I always say it's almost a non-event. It was scheduled to start on Monday through a Wednesday, and then we were going to have training on the Thursday and Friday. And Wednesday afternoon, I hadn't heard anything from the Symmetry team, so I gave Scott a call and said, when are you guys going to start this? And he said, well, what do you mean, Sharon? We're already done. I'll be there tomorrow morning for training. So it was a very simple process. It's just, sits right on top of SAP, and we were up and running. And so when we had the training, we had finance in there as well. It went very well, and we're off and running using the system. The other thing is, it should not be an IT solution only. Whatever you do in the GRC world, make sure it's a joint initiative between the people that are really involved in risk management. And generally, it's in the finance area with the controller. So when you're looking for a solution, look for things that can really help you with configuring changes all the way from the start of a request through all the processes that a developer goes through, and then the approval process to go into production. And make sure you're in that state of readiness at all times. Make sure that the data that you need is captured up front and is there for when you need it. And workflows are a great thing in life. I love those dearly. Make sure you set it up right, and then it's not a complicated process. But with workflows, you can really simplify. You can reduce the time it takes to get approvals through. You have things documented in the system for who approved things and when they approved it. It works out really well. So if you had to look at 7 key points that you wanted to take home from this presentation, I would say you don't have to put up with a lot of the manual processes that are repetitive, that you can simplify, you can automate. Understand your management's need for GRC data. What will you be audited on? What does finance need? What do they worry about? And then look for a solution that meets your company's needs. And that way it helps the whole process, and it's manageable for your company and based on your side. And seek to embed the compliance. Make sure the data is captured into the system so that when you need it, you can just pull it out and it'll be there reported for you. On-demand audit reporting is a must. And look for tools that's going to streamline your whole routine IT operations, all those repetitive manual tasks that you do. And, embrace GRC. You can use it as a tool for innovation. Maybe you can look at new ways to manage your risks. Maybe define new business rules that you hadn't thought about before. It's a whole new way to look at risk mitigation. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Heather for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Sharon and Scott. If any attendees have any questions for us, this is the time to type them into the GoToWebinar question panel there. One of the questions we always receive is, will a recording of this presentation be made available? And yes, a recording of the presentation will be available, and we will make sure that everyone receives a link to that. I'd also like to take a minute to let you know that Symmetry is running a series of webinars on SAP cloud hosting. You can learn about new developments in running production SAP in the cloud. You can learn about cloud security and migrating to the cloud and disaster recovery in the cloud. You can sign up online for these upcoming webinars at www.sim-corp.com. Our first one in this series is next Wednesday, so we'd like to encourage you to attend and find out about the solution we have for you. So at this time, we have a few questions here. We're running short on time, but I will go through one of these here. The first one is, we're interested in having department heads take more responsibility for role assignments and changes, but not all of them even use SAP. Do you have this problem, Sharon?
Well, we do use, our functional owners are our department heads, and we do require them to authorize new employee role access for those areas in their departments. And it's, you're right, a lot of them are at the VP or the director level, and they may not use SAP day to day. But the whole process with Control Panel is very easy. They get an email with a shortcut embedded in it. They click on it. It takes them right to it. They can, it's a very simple training process to show them what to look for. If they agree with it, they hit a little approve button and hit save. And some of them do forget to hit save, but we've gone through that. But it's a very easy process, so it did not turn out to be a hard thing for us.
And just to add to that too, with rolling out HCM and employee self-service and manager self-service, we were able to embed this directly in that same portal that those department heads are going into on a day-to-day, if not weekly basis anyway.
Okay, thank you. Another one that, Sharon, sounds like it's for you. It says, Sharon, you mentioned that this wasn't an IT-specific project. Was involving your business owners critical in the success of this project?
Yes, I think it definitely was, because we needed to have buy-in for one thing, but also, the risk mitigation and control is really in the finance area, because the whole purpose to manage your risk for Sarbanes-Oxley is to make sure your financial statements are produced accurately and timely. So they are very keen on it, and they do a lot of the analysis themselves. So when we got the controller and his team involved early on to look at what the possibilities were, I mean, his eyes truly lit up because he saw it, because now he has to write, or before, he had to write a lot of mitigating control letters saying, I am aware of this, I know it, but this is the reason why we have to do it this way. So with what we've implemented with ControlPanelGRC, it actually, the benefit, much of the benefit, is from the business perspective.
Okay, thank you. Another one for you, Sharon. Sharon, what tools did your team investigate when you were looking for an automated solution? What criteria were you using to assess them?
Well, we probably didn't do, an RFP. I know we didn't do an RFP, I should say. I was aware of a lot of the tools available in the marketplace. I know SAP has a very robust tool itself. But we already had a pre-existing relationship with Symmetry. They are our basis and security control for us. So when we started looking at ControlPanelGRC, it just sort of fit with what we already knew about Symmetry. SimSoft was just another division of them. The people were the same. The software was very similar to some of the stuff we were already looking at. It was just a very good fit for us. So when we looked at the benefits and to the cost and what we were trying to get out of a system, everything just sort of fell in place that ControlPanelGRC was the right solution for us.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we are up on our time here today, so I'm going to end the questions. We'd like to thank you all for participating and let you know that the presentation will be available online later this week. So we thank you again for your time today and have a great day. Thanks.